I learned something about power that night. The most dangerous men don't raise their voices, they just show up at your door. It was a little after 9 p.m. when the knock came, slow and heavy, the kind that makes the whole house feel smaller. Our porch light flickered through the thin curtains, casting a pale yellow glow across the living room. I remember the smell of cheap coffee and the ticking wall clock that sounded louder than usual. My father froze at the kitchen table. He didn't even look at the door at first. He just stared down at his hands like they suddenly didn't belong to him. I didn't understand why until I opened the door. 3 black sedans were parked along our quiet street, engines idling softly like patient animals. Men in dark suits stood beside them, still as statues, their eyes scanning everything. And in the center of it all was him, Alexander Kane. Even if you've never seen a powerful man before, you know one when he's standing 10 feet away. He wasn't tall in an obvious way, and he wasn't trying to look intimidating. He simply existed like gravity, calm, quiet, impossible to ignore. His dark coat moved slightly in the cool night air as he looked past me and into the house. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and low, like this was just another appointment on his calendar. I felt my throat tighten. Behind me, my father's chair scraped the floor. He walked into the living room slowly, each step heavier than the last. The moment he saw Alexander Kane, something inside him collapsed. My father, the man who used to fix broken trucks with his bare hands and once carried a refrigerator up 2 flights of stairs by himself, suddenly looked 10 years older. Then he did something I had never seen before in my entire life. He dropped to his knees. The sound of it was soft but final. "Mr. Kane, please," my father said, his voice trembling in a way that made my chest ache. "I just need more time." Alexander didn't move. He didn't even blink. The men behind him stayed silent, their presence filling the doorway like a wall. Kane stepped inside our house as if he had every right to be there. His shoes crossed the worn wooden floor slowly, each step measured. He glanced around. The room, the faded couch, the cracked picture frame on the wall, the stack of unpaid envelopes on the table. Nothing about his expression changed. "Your debt is $200,000, he said calmly, as if he were reading the weather forecast. My father swallowed hard. "I'll get it," he whispered. "I swear I will. I just need a little more time." For a moment, the room was completely silent except for the clock ticking on the wall. Kane looked at my father. Then his eyes shifted to me. It felt like the entire air in the room changed the second he did. His gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry either. It was simply calculating, like he had just discovered a new possibility. He studied me for a long second, then another. Finally he spoke again. "You're right," he said quietly. "He doesn't have the money." My father's shoulders trembled as he lowered his head. I felt my stomach drop, waiting for whatever came next. Kane turned slightly toward the door where his men were standing. Then his eyes returned to me. "But he has something else." For a moment I thought I misunderstood him. The words sounded simple, but the way Alexander Kane looked at me made the meaning heavier than anything I had ever felt before. My father lifted his head slowly from the floor, confusion spreading across his face like a shadow moving across a wall. "Mr. Kane," he said carefully, "I do not understand." Kane did not answer right away. He took another slow step into the living room, and the house suddenly felt even smaller, like the walls had moved closer together. I could hear the faint hum of the black sedans outside, and the quiet breathing of the men standing in the doorway. Kane studied the room again, the worn carpet beneath his shoes, the old lamp that flickered whenever the wind touched the windows. None of it seemed to surprise him. It was as if he had expected exactly this. Then his eyes returned to me, calm, focused, unreadable. "Your daughter," he said simply. My father shook his head immediately, almost before Kane finished speaking. "No," he said, the word coming out too quickly. "She has nothing to do with this." Kane tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement with polite interest. "Everything has something to do with debt," he replied. His voice never rose. It did not need to. The men behind him remained silent, their presence filling the doorway like quiet witnesses. My heart was beating so loudly I wondered if everyone in the room could hear it. I looked at my father, waiting for him to explain, to argue, to say something that would make this moment disappear. Instead, he lowered his gaze again, his shoulders slowly collapsing inward. I had never seen him look that defeated. "I will work," he said quickly. "I will take any job. I will pay every dollar." Kane nodded once, as if acknowledging the effort. "I believe you would try," he said calmly. "But effort does not change numbers." The clock on the wall ticked again. Each second felt longer than the one before it. Kane turned slightly toward the open door, and one of his men stepped forward, holding a small leather folder. Kane did not even look at it before speaking again. $200,000, he repeated quietly. Then his gaze returned to me once more. I felt frozen where I stood, like the floor had turned into stone beneath my feet. Kane walked a few steps closer until he was standing in the center of the living room. The porch light behind him created a faint outline around his shoulders, making him look almost like a shadow that had stepped inside our home. "You said you have nothing left," he told my father. "But that is not entirely true." My father looked up slowly, fear filling his eyes. "Please," he whispered. Kane did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. He simply spoke the next sentence as if it were the most reasonable solution in the world. "Your daughter will come with me." The words hung in the air, quiet but impossible to ignore. I felt the room spin slightly, like my mind had not caught up with reality yet. My father stared at Kane as if hoping the sentence would somehow change if he waited long enough. "For how long?" he asked weakly. Kane finally looked away from me and toward the dark street outside. For the first time that night, a faint expression crossed his face. Not anger, not cruelty, something colder, something certain. "Until the dead is no longer yours to carry," he said. My father looked like the air had been taken out of his lungs. He stared at Alexander Kane as if the words he had just heard could not possibly belong in the same room as us. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The clock on the wall continued its slow ticking, each sound sharp against the silence. I felt my hands grow cold at my sides. "No," my father finally said, shaking his head again, slower this time, like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream. "She is not part of this." Kane watched him calmly. There was no frustration on his face, no impatience. It was the same expression someone might wear while discussing numbers in a quiet office. "Everything connected to you is part of this," he replied. My father pushed himself up from his knees, unsteady but determined, and stepped in front of me, as if he could block the entire world with his shoulders. "She stays here," he said, his voice trembling but stubborn. Kane did not move closer. He simply observed the moment, his eyes moving from my father to me and back again. "You misunderstand," he said quietly. "This is not a negotiation." The men near the door remained perfectly still, but their presence made the room feel smaller with every second. I could hear one of the cars outside shift slightly as the engine idled. The sound reminded me that the entire street had probably gone silent. I stepped forward before I even realized I was moving. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Kane looked at me again, and something about the way he focused made the world feel quieter. "It means the debt must be answered tonight," he said. "Money would have been the simplest way." My father turned toward me quickly. "Emily, go to your room," he said under his breath, as if the situation might disappear if I was not standing there. But I did not move. I could not. The calm certainty in Kane's voice made it clear that leaving the room would not change anything. "If I go with you?" I asked slowly. "The debt is gone." My father turned back toward me immediately. "No," he said sharply. "You are not asking that question." Kane did not interrupt him. He waited, watching the exchange as if he already knew how it would end. I felt my father's hand grab my arm, his grip tight with fear. "You do not understand who this man is," he whispered. I looked at him carefully. For the first time that night, I realized something else. He did understand exactly who Alexander Kane was. That was the real reason he looked so afraid. I gently pulled my arm free. "If I go," I repeated, looking at Kane, "the $200,000 is no longer my father's problem." Kane held my gaze for a moment before answering. "Correct." The word was simple and absolute. My father shook his head again, panic rising in his voice. "There has to be another way." Kane glanced toward the door, then back at the room as if measuring the final seconds of patience. "There always is," he said calmly. "But this one is the fastest." I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Outside, one of the car doors opened with a soft click. Kane stepped slightly aside, creating a clear path to the front door. He did not reach for me. He did not command me to move. He simply looked at me and spoke one final sentence. "You can stay here," he said quietly. "But the debt will stay too." I looked at the open doorway and realized that my entire life had just been reduced to a single choice. The cool night air drifted into the living room, carrying the low hum of the engines outside and the faint smell of rain on asphalt. My father stood frozen beside me, his face pale under the porch light. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, like the weight of those $200,000 had been pressing on his shoulders for years, and tonight it had finally crushed him. I knew he would never ask me to leave with Alexander Kane, but I also knew he would never escape that debt if I stayed. I took a slow breath and stepped toward the door. The floor creaked softly under my shoes. My father grabbed my wrist again, his hand shaking. "Emily, do not do this," he said quietly, his voice full of a fear that made my chest tighten. I looked at him and tried to smile even though my heart felt like it was breaking inside my ribs. "It is just temporary," I said, even though I had no idea if that was true. Alexander Kane watched us without interrupting, his expression calm, almost distant, like he was observing a scene he had seen many times before. The men near the door moved slightly to the side, making space as I walked closer. The night outside felt colder than the room behind me. The black sedans were lined along the curb, their headlights dim but steady, reflecting off the wet pavement of our quiet street. Everything looked strangely normal, like the rest of the world had no idea that my life was about to change completely. I stopped a few feet away from Kane. Up close, he smelled faintly of clean cologne and cold air. His coat moved slightly with the breeze. "If I go with you," I said slowly, making sure my voice did not shake, "the debt disappears." Kane looked at me for a long second, as if measuring the seriousness behind the words. "Your father will not hear about it again," he replied. Behind me, my father whispered my name like a warning. I did not turn around this time. I was afraid if I looked at him again, I might lose the courage to keep walking forward. Kane glanced toward one of the cars and gave a small nod. One of the men opened the rear door of the nearest sedan. The interior light glowed softly against the dark street. Kane stepped slightly aside and gestured toward the car. "You should bring a coat," he said calmly. I almost laughed at the strange politeness of that sentence. Instead, I walked back inside for a moment, grabbed the old jacket hanging near the door, and looked around the living room one last time. The worn couch, the flickering lamp, the small kitchen where my father used to cook breakfast on Sunday mornings. It all felt farther away already. My father stood in the same spot, his eyes filled with a helpless silence that hurt more than any argument could have. I stepped toward him and hugged him quickly before he could stop me. "It will be okay," I whispered, even though neither of us truly believed it. Then I turned and walked out the door before I could change my mind. The night air wrapped around me as I crossed the short distance to the car. When I sat down inside, the leather seat felt cold against my back. The door closed softly beside me. Through the window, I saw my father standing in the doorway of our house, smaller and smaller as the engine began to move. Alexander Kane stepped into the seat across from me a moment later, calm as ever, and as the car pulled away from the curb, he looked at me and said the first words that made me realize this night was only the beginning. The car moved smoothly down our quiet street, and for the first few seconds I could still see my house through the rear window. The porch light looked smaller with every passing moment until it finally disappeared behind the corner. I kept my eyes on the glass even after it was gone, as if staring long enough might somehow bring it back. The inside of the sedan was silent except for the soft sound of the engine and the distant noise of tires rolling over damp pavement. The leather seat beneath me felt unfamiliar, too clean, too expensive for someone like me. Across from me sat Alexander Kane, calm and composed, his posture relaxed as if this ride was the most ordinary thing in the world. For a while neither of us spoke. The city lights slowly began to replace the dark houses of my neighborhood as we drove farther away. Finally, I forced myself to look up at him. "Where are we going?" I asked. My voice sounded quieter than I expected. Kane glanced toward the window for a moment before answering. "Home," he said simply. The word made my stomach tighten. I folded my hands together in my lap, trying to keep them from shaking. "And how long do I stay there?" I asked. Kane studied me briefly, not in a threatening way, but with the calm focus of someone observing details most people would miss. "Until the situation is resolved," he replied. The answer felt carefully chosen, like it revealed just enough and nothing more. The car turned onto a wider road where the streetlights stood tall every few yards, casting long golden reflections across the windshield. I noticed the other black sedans following behind us, their headlights moving in quiet formation. It suddenly occurred to me that this man did not travel alone anywhere. I leaned my head slightly against the window and watched the city pass by. Stores closed for the night. Neon signs flickering in quiet corners. People walking along sidewalks who had no idea that a girl who had just traded herself for a debt was sitting inside one of these cars. "You could have taken something else," I said after a moment. Kane looked at me again. "There was nothing else," he answered calmly. "You saw the house." I did not know why, but the way he said it did not sound like an insult. It sounded more like a simple fact. The car slowed as we entered a part of the city I had only seen in magazines and television shows. Tall buildings rose into the night sky, their windows glowing like stars stacked in perfect lines. Expensive restaurants and quiet hotel entrances lined the streets. Everything looked polished and distant from the world I had just left behind. The sedan turned into a private driveway beside one of the tallest buildings I had ever seen. The glass walls of the lobby reflected the headlights as we pulled to a gentle stop near the entrance. One of the men stepped out first and opened the door for Kane. Kane exited the car without hurry, then turned back toward me. The night air felt cooler here, carrying the faint scent of the river somewhere nearby. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out onto the pavement. The building towered above us, so tall I had to tilt my head just to see the upper floors disappearing into the darkness. Kane watched my reaction with quiet patience. Then he gestured toward the entrance with a small movement of his hand. "Welcome to the place where you will be staying," he said. I looked up at the glowing windows high above us and suddenly realized something that made my heart beat faster. This was not just a visit. I had just stepped into Alexander Kane's world. I stood for a moment in front of the towering glass entrance, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. The building stretched upward like a wall of light against the dark sky, each floor glowing softly, as if an entirely different world existed above the street. People in elegant coats moved quietly through the lobby doors, their footsteps confident, their conversations calm, as if this place belonged to them. I felt completely out of place standing there in my worn jacket and old shoes. Alexander Kane noticed my hesitation but did not rush me. He simply waited beside me with the same steady patience he had shown all night. Finally, he turned and walked toward the entrance, and I realized I had no real choice but to follow. The lobby doors opened automatically as we approached, and warm air wrapped around me the second we stepped inside. The floor beneath my feet was polished stone that reflected the lights above like still water. A tall chandelier hung from the ceiling, sending soft golden light across the entire room. I had never been inside a building like this before. The space felt more like a hotel from a movie than a place where someone actually lived. A man behind the front desk immediately straightened when he saw Kane approaching. "Good evening, Mr. Kane," he said respectfully. Kane gave a small nod, but did not stop walking. His presence alone seemed to change the atmosphere around him. Conversations in the lobby softened. A few people glanced in our direction before quickly looking away. I stayed a step behind him, trying to absorb everything without staring too obviously. We crossed the lobby and approached a set of private elevators at the far wall. One of the men who had arrived with us pressed a small silver button on the panel. The elevator doors opened almost instantly. Kane stepped inside and waited again until I followed. The doors closed behind us with a quiet sound that felt strangely final. Inside the elevator, the walls were lined with dark mirrors that reflected the two of us from every angle. I saw my own nervous expression and quickly looked down at my hands. Kane pressed the highest floor on the panel. The elevator began to move smoothly upward. For several seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the cables pulling us higher into the building. I finally gathered enough courage to speak again. "How many floors are there?" I asked quietly. Kane glanced at the digital numbers as they climbed one by one. 52, he replied. I felt my stomach tighten as the numbers continued rising. Each floor meant we were getting farther from the street, farther from the small world I understood. "And you live on the top one?" I said slowly. Kane nodded once. "It is quieter up there." The elevator continued its smooth climb, and I could feel the pressure changing slightly in my ears. I wondered how different the view must look from that height. The doors finally opened with a soft chime. The hallway beyond was quiet and wide, lit by soft recessed lights along the walls. Thick carpet absorbed every sound of our footsteps as we walked toward a large set of double doors at the end of the corridor. Kane stopped in front of them, and entered a code on a small panel beside the frame. The lock released with a quiet click. He opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter first. I hesitated at the threshold, realizing that whatever waited on the other side was now part of my life, whether I was ready for it or not. Then I took a breath and walked inside. I stepped across the threshold slowly, unsure what I expected to see, but certain it would not feel like home. The door closed quietly behind me, and the soft click echoed through a space far larger than I imagined. For a moment, I simply stood there, taking it in. The entire penthouse opened into a wide living area, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the city stretching endlessly in every direction. Lights from the streets below looked like glowing rivers weaving between the buildings. From this height, the noise of the city disappeared completely. Everything felt distant and quiet, like the world had been placed behind glass. I walked a few steps farther inside, my shoes sinking slightly into a thick carpet that felt softer than anything I had ever stepped on before. The furniture was simple but elegant, all clean lines and dark colors. Nothing looked cluttered. Nothing looked accidental. Every piece seemed carefully placed, like the entire room had been designed for calm control. Alexander Kane entered a moment after me and closed the door. When he moved through the room, it felt natural, like this space had been shaped around him. I turned slowly in a circle, trying to understand how one person could live in a place that looked more like a private hotel suite than an apartment. The kitchen stretched along one wall with polished marble counters and quiet stainless steel appliances. A long dining table stood nearby, large enough for 10 people even though the room felt like it belonged to only one. Beyond the living area, a hallway disappeared deeper into the penthouse. I stopped near the windows and looked down. The street was so far below that the cars appeared no larger than toys moving along thin ribbons of light. The height made my stomach tighten slightly. "You will get used to the view," Kane said from behind me. I turned and saw him setting his coat over the back of a chair. Even without the coat, he looked composed, his movements controlled, his attention steady. "I am not sure I will," I admitted quietly. Kane walked closer, but kept a respectful distance. "Most people say that on their first night here," he replied. I crossed my arms lightly, still trying to process the strange reality of standing in this place. "How many people live here?" I asked. Kane looked around the room briefly before answering. "Only me." The answer surprised me more than the size of the apartment. A place this large felt designed for gatherings, for conversations, for a life full of activity. But the silence inside it suggested something very different. Kane gestured toward the hallway. "There is a guest room prepared," he said calmly. "You will stay there." I followed his gesture and noticed the soft lighting along the corridor, the closed doors spaced evenly along the wall. Everything looked orderly and quiet, almost too perfect. "And the rules?" I asked before I could stop myself. Kane raised one eyebrow slightly, as if he appreciated the direct question. For a moment, he considered his answer. Then he spoke in the same calm voice he had used all night. "They are simple," he said. "You are safe here. No one will bother you. In return, you stay inside the building unless I say otherwise." I looked at him carefully. The sentence sounded polite, but the meaning was clear. This place might be beautiful, but it was also a boundary. A very high one. Kane noticed my expression and added one final sentence that made the quiet room feel even heavier. "Think of it less as a cage," he said calmly, "and more as protection." I looked at Alexander Kane for a long moment, trying to decide whether his words were meant to comfort me or warn me. The city lights reflected in the tall windows behind him, outlining his figure against the endless glow of buildings and streets far below. Protection from what? I asked quietly. Kane did not answer immediately. He walked toward the windows and rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair as he looked out over the city. From where I stood, I could see his reflection in the glass, calm and thoughtful, like a man calculating something far away. "From problems that follow people who owe large amounts of money," he said after a moment. The answer sounded simple, but it raised more questions than it solved. I turned back toward the hallway he had pointed out earlier. The silence inside the penthouse felt deeper now, like the building itself was holding its breath. "So I stay here while my father's debt disappears," I said slowly. Kane nodded once. "That is the arrangement." I walked toward the hallway, my footsteps quiet against the carpet. The first door on the left opened into a bedroom larger than the entire living room in our house. Soft lighting glowed along the walls. A wide bed sat in the center of the room with crisp white sheets that looked untouched. A tall window stretched along one side, revealing the same breathtaking view of the city. A small desk stood near the corner beside a shelf filled with books that looked carefully arranged. I stepped farther inside and ran my fingers lightly across the edge of the desk. Everything felt clean, organized, almost too perfect for someone like me. Kane remained in the doorway for a moment before speaking again. "If you need anything, someone in the building will bring it," he said. I turned to face him. "Someone?" Kane gave a small nod. "Staff. They handle most things here." The word staff sounded strange in my ears. My entire life, I had never lived in a place where staff existed. I glanced around the room again, trying to imagine how long I might stay here. Days. Weeks. Maybe longer. The thought made the room feel both safe and unsettling at the same time. "And you?" I asked. Kane looked slightly surprised by the question. "What about me?" he replied. "Will I see you?" I clarified. For a moment he studied my expression as if deciding how honest to be. "Sometimes," he said calmly. "My work keeps me busy." I nodded slowly. That answer sounded exactly like the man who had calmly stepped into my house and changed everything with a few quiet sentences. Kane stepped back from the doorway, giving me space. "You should rest," he said. "It has been a long night." I watched as he turned and walked back toward the main living area. His footsteps faded into the quiet of the penthouse. For the first time since leaving home, I was completely alone. I walked to the window and looked down at the city again. From 52 floors above the ground, everything seemed distant and peaceful. But something about Kane's earlier words kept echoing in my mind. Protection from problems that follow people with large debts. I pressed my hand lightly against the cool glass and realized something that made my heart beat a little faster. If I needed protection up here, it meant the real danger was somewhere down there in the city below. I did not sleep much that night. The bed was soft and the room was quiet, but my mind refused to slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father standing in the doorway of our house, the porch light behind him, the look on his face when the car pulled away. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and walked back to the tall window beside the bed. The city was still awake far below. Lines of headlights moved slowly along the streets, and the distant glow of buildings stretched across the horizon. From 52 floors above the ground, everything looked peaceful, almost beautiful. It was strange to think that somewhere down there were the problems Alexander Kane believed I needed protection from. I wrapped my arms around myself and leaned lightly against the glass, trying to understand what kind of world I had stepped into. After a while, I heard quiet footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it might be someone from the building staff Kane had mentioned, but the steps were slower and more deliberate. The door opened gently a moment later, and Alexander Kane stepped inside. He did not seem surprised to find me awake. "You should be resting," he said calmly. I looked back at the city before turning toward him. "I tried," I replied. Kane walked a few steps into the room, stopping near the desk where the soft lamp still glowed. For a moment, he studied the view through the window the same way I had earlier. "The first night here is usually the hardest," he said. "Everything feels unfamiliar." I nodded slowly. "You said this place is protection," I reminded him. "Protection from who?" Kane did not answer right away. His expression remained thoughtful, like he was deciding how much truth the moment required. Finally, he looked back at me. "There are people in this city who watch everything connected to money," he said. "When a debt grows large enough, attention follows it." I felt a quiet chill run through me. "So someone was watching my father?" I asked. Kane's eyes remained steady. "Not just your father," he replied. "Anyone close to him." The words made the room feel colder despite the warm lights. I realized then that the decision I made earlier that night might have done more than erase a number written on paper. It might have moved a target away from my family. I turned fully toward Kane. "That is why you took me instead of waiting for the money," I said slowly. Kane watched me carefully, and for the first time I noticed something almost human behind the calm control he carried. Not regret, not guilt, something quieter. "Your father was already in deeper trouble than he realized," he said. I let that sentence settle in the silence between us. Outside the window, a distant siren echoed faintly through the city streets. "And now?" I asked. Kane glanced toward the lights below before answering. "Now the debt belongs to me." I frowned slightly, trying to understand. What does that mean for me? Cain looked back at me, his voice calm but certain. It means the people who were watching your father will now be watching my world instead. I felt my heart beat faster as the weight of that statement settled in my mind. Cain turned toward the door, preparing to leave, but paused before stepping out. Without looking back, he added one final sentence that made me realize my life had changed in ways I had not even begun to understand. And whether you realize it or not, he said quietly, you are already part of that world now.